Welcome back to A World History of Christianity, Chapter 10, Part 1, China and Its Neighbors, R. G. Tiedemann. The introduction of Christianity into Eastern Asia proved exceptionally difficult, for here it encountered highly sophisticated and culturally stable societies based on different ideological and organizational principles. Southeast Asia had long been exposed to cultural and religious influences from India, which further added to the significant ethnic and cultural diversity of the region. Theravada Buddhism, in both its elite and folk variants, was strongly entrenched among the dominant ethnic groups of Burma and Siam, modern Thailand, and played a central part in the politico-religious traditions of these kingdoms. In the Southeast Asian island world, animist traditions remained strong in spite of the introduction of elements of Hinduism in ancient times and the expansion of Islam into the region since the 12th century. The East Asian world consisted of the large, Confucianized high cultures of China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. These powerful polities, with their organized religions, hierarchies of priests and monks, sophisticated scriptures, and well-endowed temples, proved particularly resistant to the introduction of alien religious systems from Western Eurasia. China before 1500, Nestorians and Franciscans. Much of pre-modern East and Southeast Asia was subject to or influenced by China, the dominant cultural and political power in the region. In time, this populous but distant empire was to become the principal object of Western evangelization. However, it was an Eastern variant of the Christian faith that first gained entrance into China. As Nestorian Christianity spread eastward from Persia, among the Turkic nomads of Central Asia and along well-established trade routes, it eventually came into contact with Chinese civilization probably sometime in the 6th century. The first reliable evidence of Christian missionary activity in China is found on the famous Nestorian monument erected in 781 and rediscovered in 1625, with its lengthy informative inscriptions in Chinese and Syriac. It states that a certain Alopen arrived in the Tang dynasty's capital of Shenzhen, now Xi'an, in 635 during the reign of Emperor Taizong, 627 through 649. This was a period of remarkable cultural openness and religious tolerance, allowing native Daoism as well as foreign creeds such as Buddhism and to a lesser extent Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and Islam to exist alongside Confucianism, the orthodox tradition of Chinese culture. As the following passage inscribed on the stele indicates, Christianity too had received imperial patronage. Bishop Alo Pen of the kingdom of Taichin, Syria, bringing with him the sutras and images, has come from afar and presented them at our capital. Having carefully examined the scope of his teaching, we find it to be mysteriously spiritual and of silent operation. Having observed its principal and most essential points, we reached the conclusion that they cover all that is most important in life. With imperial financial support, the first Christian church and monastery were built at Shenzhen in 638. In the same year, Alopen, with the permission of the emperor and help of Chinese collaborators, completed the translation of the Sutra of Jesus the Messiah, which thus became the first Christian book in Chinese. By this time, 21 Nestorian monks, probably all from Persia, were active in China. However, after these auspicious beginnings, two developments were to affect the Nestorian mission in China: the persecutions Under the pro-Buddhist Empress Wu, 625 through 705, and the Arab conquests in Western Asia, which cut off the Nestorian missionary outpost from its Persian heartland. Still, during the reign of Xuanzong, 712 through 756, the church recovered and made considerable progress. According to the monument, church buildings were restored and new missionaries arrived from Persia by sea in 744. Moreover, the faith spread among the Uyghurs, the dominant Turco-Mongolian power on China's northwestern frontier. Yet in the Chinese Empire itself, Nestorianism was in decline soon after the erection of the monument. The great persecution under Emperor Wenzong in 845 proved particularly disastrous. In the final analysis, its fortunes had always been too closely tied to those of the Tang, and when the dynasty was overthrown in 907, China's first Christian church vanished in the chaos which followed. As Samuel Moffat concludes, the decisive factor which caused the collapse of the Chinese church was neither religious persecution nor theological compromise, nor even its foreignness, but rather the fall of the imperial house on which the church had too long relied for its patronage and protection. However, the Nestorian faith survived among some of China's inner Asian neighbors. The Mongol expansion in Asia created relative stability along the principal trade routes which significantly promoted the movement of peoples, goods, and ideas between East and West Asia, creating the conditions for the reappearance of Christianity in China. Nestorianism returned to the Middle Kingdom in the wake of the Mongol conquest of North China in 1260. The Mongol world empire also facilitated direct contacts between Chinese and Europeans. The latter responded to stories circulating in Europe by the middle of the 12th century of a benevolent Christian ruler named Prester John, who was said to live among the nomads of Central Asia. Pope Innocent IV and other European rulers conceived the idea of an alliance with the Mongols against Islam. Thus, the Council of Lyons in 1245 decided to send fact-finding missions to the Mongols to establish friendly relations with them and possibly convert them. One of the missions, led by the Franciscan friar John of Plano Carpini, Giovanni del Pian di Carpini, arrived in the Mongol capital at Karakorum in time to witness the enthronement on 24 August 1246 of Guyuk, the third great Khan, 1246 through 1248. Although John was received by the new supreme Mongol ruler, the papal letters urging the Mongols to convert to Christianity and abandon their military campaigns in Europe angered Guyuk. Consequently, Plano Carpini returned empty-handed, arriving in Lyons in November 1247. Other missions to the east were equally ill-fated, including the one which set out in 1253 under William of Rubruck, a Franciscan in the entourage of crusading King Louis IX of France. An interview with the new great Khan Monke, 1251 through 59, merely aggravated long-standing differences. However, Rubruck left a more detailed account of life in the Mongol capital and the various people assembled there from many parts of Eurasia. While it alludes to the presence of Christians, it also reveals more clearly the persisting antagonism between Nestorians and Catholics. Thus, in connection with the Easter celebrations in 1254, a great crowd of Christians appeared, Hungarians, Alans, Russians, Georgians, and Armenians, none of whom had set eyes on the sacrament since their capture, as the Nestorians would not admit them into their church, from what they told us, unless they were rebaptized by them. During the period of Mongol rule, East Asian Christians also came to Europe. In 1287, Arghun, the Ilkhan of Persia, sent the Nestorian monk Rabban Soma on an embassy to foster an alliance with the Europeans. He visited Rome, Paris, and Bordeaux and met the Pope and the kings of France and England. Originally, Soma had set out on a pilgrimage from China to Jerusalem with a monk named Rabban Marcos, but they were unable to reach their destination and remained in the Nestorian heartland in Iraq. Both were Ongut Turks from Inner Mongolia. Some of the Onguts, along with elements of other Turco-Mongolian tribes, such as the Uyghurs, Kirates, and Naimans, had converted to Nestorian Christianity several generations earlier. In this connection, it is interesting to note that the Nestorian Kirate princess, Sorkoktani, died 1252, was the mother of Kublai Khan, who in 1271 founded the Yuan dynasty in North China and by 1279 had conquered all of China. It was his pragmatic policy of religious toleration which enabled Nestorianism to make a comeback in China proper. Kublai's vulnerable situation as a foreign ruler of a subjugated but thickly populated and highly civilized China led him to adopt a strategy of administering the country through foreign intermediaries. This in turn gave these advisors, including Eastern Christians, far more power than their small numbers warranted. The favorable conditions prevailing during the Yuan dynasty also allowed Roman Catholicism to enter the Middle Kingdom itself. A solitary Franciscan friar, John of Montesorvino, after an arduous journey by sea via India, reached Khanbalik, or Dadu, present-day Beijing, in 1294 and was received by Emperor Temur Oljietu, 1294 through 1307, grandson of the recently deceased Kublai. With the help of the influential Prince George of the Onguts, whom he had converted from Nestorianism, thereby aggravating the smoldering enmity between Nestorians and Catholics, John was permitted to build a church in Beijing in 1299 on land bought by an Italian merchant, Peter of Lucalongo. In a letter written in 1305, he reported some 6,000 converts. He added that, "I have already grown old, and my hair is white from the labors and tribulations rather than years, for I am 58 years old." By then he had built a second church and assembled and baptized some 150 boys, instructing them in Greek and Latin and teaching some of them to sing the divine office. In recognition of these achievements, Pope Clement V appointed him Archbishop of Kambalik, and Patriarch of the East. However, it would be several years before reinforcements arrived from Europe. Of 7 Franciscan bishops sent out by the Pope, only 3 reached Khanbalik in 1308. They spent 5 years in the capital, supported by generous grants from the Emperor of China. In 1313, the Franciscan China mission was able to expand when a wealthy Armenian woman provided the funds to build a church in the important port of Quanzhou, Zaytun, in Fujian province. Subsequently, a Catholic presence was also established in Yangzhou, Hangzhou, Quincy, and other places. Around 1322, a Franciscan visitor, Alderic of Pordenone, circa 1265 through 1331, arrived in South China, carrying with him the bones of 4 Franciscans who had been killed in India during an earlier attempt to reach China. On his way to Beijing, he visited members of his order at Quanzhou and Hangzhou. One other rather large group of clerics is known to have reached China, led by John of Marignoli. They set out from Avignon in 1338, reaching Beijing in 1342. 5 years later, John left China via Guangzhou to return to Europe. By this time, the Yuan dynasty was already in decline, to be overthrown in 1368. The fifth bishop of Zaytun, James of Florence, was killed by Chinese patriots in 1362, and in 1369, all Christians were expelled from Beijing. Once again, Christianity disappeared with the fall of the dynasty. The new isolationist Chinese Ming dynasty would not tolerate foreigners and their religions, whether Catholic or Nestorian. The planting of Christianity, 1500 through 1800. The expansion of Portuguese colonial and mercantile power in Asia during the first half of the 16th century was accomplished by a surge of militant Catholic missionary zeal to preach Christianity to the peoples of the newly discovered countries. In accordance with a bull of Pope Alexander VI, 1493, and the treaties of Tordesillas, 1494, and Saragossa, 1529, the world had been divided into two exclusive spiritual jurisdictions under the royal patronage of the monarchs of Spain and Portugal, who assumed direct responsibility for the conversion of the heathen and the building of churches and monasteries. Consequently, as the Portuguese proceeded to establish a string of trading stations in Asia, extending from Goa, 1510, in India to Malacca, 1511, on the Malay Peninsula, Ternate, 1522, Tidor and Ambon in the Maluku or Spice Islands, Phaipho, now called Hoi An, near Da Nang in Vietnam, Macao in China, granted as a trading post in 1557, and Japan. Priests came along as chaplains and evangelists under the royal patronage arrangement. Except for the major establishments at Malacca, the Portuguese were not particularly successful in planting Christianity in Southeast Asia. In the Indonesian islands, the high point came in 1546 with the arrival of the Spanish Jesuit Francis Xavier, 1506 through 52. He spent 2 years in the Maluku region and was said to have made thousands of converts among the non-Muslim tribes. His missionary efforts stimulated a wider interest in Christianity, and by 1555, some 30 villages on the island of Ambon had become Christian. Even so, the lack of priests meant that such congregations were left to their own devices. Moreover, because the Portuguese crown failed to provide effective support, the missionaries were unable to assist local rulers who had accepted Christianity against their, more often than not, Muslim enemies. The Catholic mission was further weakened after 1605 when the Dutch East India Company drove the Portuguese from Ambon and Tidor. Only some remnants of Dominican mission work survived into the 19th century on the islands of Solor and Flores in the vicinity of Portuguese East Timor. The capture of Portuguese Malacca by the Dutch in 1641 and the destruction of its numerous monasteries and churches severely reduced the Catholic presence in Southeast Asia. The Philippines. Whereas the Christianity promoted by the Portuguese made relatively little impression in much of Southeast Asia, the situation was quite different under royal Spanish patronage in the Philippines. After initial contact had been made by Magellan's ill-fated fleet in Cebu in 1521, evangelization began in earnest with the decision of King Philip II in 1570 to commit Spain to the colonization and Christianization of the islands. Following the capture of Manila, the local chief agreed to a treaty accepting Spanish protection and the propagation of Christianity. By 1595, there were 134 missionaries working in the Philippines, and it was estimated that 288,000 baptisms had taken place. The Christianizing process in the Philippines followed precedents already established in Spanish America, where missionaries had learned that it was vital to obtain the conversion of chiefs in order to win over their followers, and that the most effective way of converting local leaders was to teach Christian ideas to their children. An important factor in the success of Christianity was the fact that many aspects of worship could be accommodated by Filipino culture. It is important to note that, except for Mindanao in the south, where Islam had made some inroads, the Spanish did not have to confront the high cultures of mainland Asia. Instead, in a setting where animism was the dominant belief amongst the various local social groupings, Christian practices were vaguely akin to indigenous rituals. It has been suggested that the sprinkling of holy water, the recitation of prayers in Latin, and the sign of the cross provided an alternative to animistic healing rites. At the same time, traditional popular Filipino practices were included in or adapted to Christian worship, in spite of missionary concern. In a society where spirit worship was widely practiced, the vast array of Catholic holy figures was accepted as an effectual and attractive source of power. As had hitherto been the case with the ancestors, the names of saints could be invoked to obtain assistance and protection. Blessed by the priest, rosaries, crosses, and holy medals became potent talismans. On the other hand, Filipinos gradually came to accept the Christian idea of monogamy and the indissolubility of marriage. In this way, a kind of folk Catholicism was enabled to take firm root in the northern part of the Philippines. The rise and fall of Christianity in late medieval Japan. The Catholic missionary effort in Japan followed closely on the heels of Portuguese traders who had first reached the country in 1543. On 15 August 1549, Francis Xavier and his confreres, Torres and Fernandez, landed at Kagoshima, the capital of Satsuma, one of the most powerful Han feudal domains in western Japan. They were accompanied by the Japanese Paul Yajiro, or Anjiro, who, having fled Japan in 1544 in a Portuguese ship to avoid arrest for manslaughter, was baptized and received a rudimentary education at St. Paul's College, Goa. He now served the priests as interpreter. The missionaries soon were able to establish cordial relations with some of the important men. In the unstable political environment of 16th century Japan, a time of civil war, all the Western Han feared for their independence and sought to attract Portuguese aid. The Jesuits were particularly successful on the southern island of Kyushu, where they were able to convert important local daimyo, feudal lords, who in turn ordered their subject people to adopt the foreign religion. Not long after Xavier's departure in 1551, the remaining missionaries began to look to the central area, Japan's cultural heartland, where the old capital was located, as well as what passed for central government. They continued the practice of cultivating friendly relations with and gaining the support of influential persons. Thus, Gaspar Villela S.J., 1525 through 72, was granted an audience with the shogun, military ruler, in 1559. In time, the Jesuits succeeded in gaining the friendship even of the hegemonic ruler Oda Nobunaga, 1534 through 82, who by 1568 was the most powerful man in Japan. The fact that the Buddhist sects had generally sided with his enemies may explain why he treated the Jesuits well during these uncertain years in Japanese history. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1537 through 98, Nobunaga's successor as military ruler of Japan, seemed similarly well disposed toward the foreign religion. In 1583, for example, he provided the land for the construction of a church in Osaka. In the meantime, the missionaries were beginning to make greater efforts to adapt to the local culture. The Italian Jesuit Alessandro Valignano, 1539 through 1606, who had arrived in 1579 to conduct the first of 3 inspection tours, immediately set out to reverse the rigid policy of Mission Superior Francisco Cabral, who had maintained that Japanese Christians would have to adopt the manners and practices of the Portuguese Jesuits. In contrast, Valignano insisted that the foreign priests must, as far as possible, accommodate themselves to indigenous sensibilities and ways of doing things, as long as they did not run counter to the Christian creed. They were to adopt the Japanese lifestyle in dress, cleanliness, food, and housing. Furthermore, the missionaries were to pay careful attention to the niceties of etiquette to ensure success for their strategy of working from the top down. It was, after all, the Jesuits' hope to transform the Asian countries into Christian lands by first converting the rulers and then allowing the faith to trickle down to the populace at large. As a result of the expanding missionary endeavor in the second half of the 16th century, other Western religious and commercial influences entered the country. Initially, the Portuguese played a dominant role. By the early 1600s, Dutch and English traders, that is to say, Protestant heretics, began to challenge the Portuguese position. Moreover, the Jesuit missionary monopoly was broken in 1593 with arrival in Japan of the first Spanish Franciscans from Manila. The Jesuits' approach brought them into conflicts with other missionaries with disastrous consequences. Whereas the Jesuits had worked with Japan's leaders, the Franciscan friars began to proselytize among the poor and criticize the Jesuit policy of accommodation. This proliferation and the ensuing competition and intrigue amongst the foreigners alarmed Japanese leaders. As early as 1587, anti-Christian edicts were published but not rigorously enforced. The shogun Ieyasu, 1542 through 1616, who in 1603 established the central feudal Tokugawa state and at first had been friendly to the Christians, soon turned against them. In 1606, Christianity was declared illegal, and on 27 January 1614, the famous edict against Christianity was published, which included the following passage. The Christian band have come to Japan, not only sending their merchant vessels to exchange commodities, but also longing to disseminate an evil law, to overthrow true doctrine, so that they may change the government of the country and obtain possession of the land. This is the germ of great disaster and must be crushed. In that year, Ieyasu embarked on a long and painful destruction of Christianity, which intensified under his successor, commencing with a serious campaign to expel the missionaries. The greatest tragedy occurred, however, in 1637 through 38, when a peasant uprising in the Shimabara Amakusa area of western Kyushu, in which Christians took a leading part, was brutally suppressed by the government. Some 37,000 peasants are said to have lost their lives. As a result of the savage attacks, the number of Christians, 300,000 out of a population of some 25 million inhabitants before the persecutions, was much reduced. Yet some survived as underground communities into the 19th century. Some Christians managed to flee abroad, establishing Japanese congregations in Phaipho in Vietnam and in Ayutthaya in Siam. Japan itself was now closed to virtually all European influences except for the precarious Dutch establishment at Deshima Island near Nagasaki. In the end, Catholicism failed because it was not compatible with Japanese tradition, in particular with Buddhism. At the same time, the initial missionary successes coincided with attacks of important Japanese military leaders on powerful Buddhist interests. Moreover, Christianity had gained a toehold precisely at a time of internal difficulty, during the brutal age of the country at war, Sengoku, particularly during the period of 1560 through 87. But once the political stability and intellectual orthodoxy had been restored by the Tokugawa shoguns, an alien faith could no longer be tolerated, especially one that had engaged in political intrigue. Christianity came to be seen as potentially subversive, not only of the political order, but of the basic social structure, for it challenged accepted values and beliefs. The work of the Franciscans and Dominicans among the masses, rather than the elites, was regarded as undermining the established hierarchical order from below. As the Shimabara rebellion seemed to indicate, Christianity was seen to inspire disloyalty and had to be eradicated like a disease. Missionary association with European expansion was perceived as a threat from abroad, most notably from the Spanish in the Philippines. Given the new political realities of early Tokugawa Japan, few of the so-called Christian daimyo or their successors kept the faith. One notable exception was Takayama Yukon, who remained a committed Christian. Having been dispossessed by Hideyoshi in 1587, he was expelled from Japan during the general persecution of 1614 and died the following year in exile in Manila. The entire Tokugawa period is marked by persistent and rigorous enforcement of anti-Christian laws long after the early 1600s. In 1640, the Office of Inquisition for Christian Affairs was established in Edo, modern Tokyo, to oversee the surveillance of Christians. Throughout the country, Buddhist temples were entrusted with the investigation of Christianity and other evil religions. This control was supplemented with another severe anti-Christian practice, namely the ceremony of ifumi, or picture stepping. Sacred pictures of Christ or the Virgin Mary were placed on the ground, and all the inhabitants of cities and villages were ordered to trample on them to demonstrate their rejection of the Christian faith. The practice was eventually abandoned in 1857 under pressure from Western powers. Late Imperial China. There is no concrete evidence that some of the Christian congregations of the Mongol period survived into the late Ming and early Qing, although later Christian communities claimed such a link. It would not be until the long-lived native Ming dynasty experienced domestic decay in the late 16th century that the opportunity for renewed missionary activity emerged. The early modern mission in China is closely linked to that in Japan. Francis Xavier, having started to work in Japan, hoped to begin work amongst the populous Chinese as well, but he died in 1552 on Shangchuan Island, St. John's Island, off the coast of southern China, before he could reach his goal. 3 further Jesuit attempts to enter China also failed before Alessandro Valignano established a special training center at the Portuguese settlement of Macao, enabling missionaries to study the Chinese language and culture in preparation for work in China. The basic rules of accommodation which Valignano had established for Japan were applied by the first 2 Jesuit missionaries who successfully entered the Chinese Empire in 1583, namely the Italians Matteo Ricci, 1552 through 1610, and Michel Ruggieri, 1543 through 1607. They began to study both the vernacular and classical Chinese languages. After a number of false starts, they were invited by the prefect of Zhaoqing near Guangzhou Canton to reside in his city. They arrived there in September 1583, and Ricci remained until 1589. These were important years of preparation and adaptation for the Jesuit mission in China. Between 1589 and 1601, Ricci traveled and established a number of missions in some cities of central China. Finally, in 1601, he was permitted to travel to Beijing, the imperial capital, and the years from 1601 until his death in 1610 mark the peak of his achievement, setting the pattern of activity for the Jesuit mission in late imperial China. Ricci was determined to win the respect of Chinese scholars and officials in intellectual terms in two ways. He set out to acquire a familiarity with the Confucian classics so that he could bring references to traditional Chinese literature to bear in his arguments. At the same time, he strove to impress the Chinese elite with the achievements of Occidental intellect to convince them that the Europeans were no mere barbarians. He demonstrated the results of Western astronomy and mathematics, and the value of mechanical skills such as instruments and clocks. Perhaps the most noteworthy achievement during these years was Ricci's production of a world map with Chinese characters. This approach brought Ricci and his colleagues to the attention of well-known scholars and high-ranking officials. They were even permitted to engage in personal discussion with some of the emperors. In view of their scientific knowledge, some Jesuits were retained by the imperial court as quasi-officials. Once they had gained the intellectual respect of the Chinese elite, the early Jesuit missionaries would start to preach their doctrines, avoiding unnecessary conflict with Chinese traditions and questions of dogma that might spark off controversy. Ricci in particular would interpret the terms used in Chinese classic texts as elements of Christian doctrine, where this would be appropriate. By this means, he was hoping to show an identity of basic Christian ideas with those of what he called ancient Confucianism, before it had become perverted into Neo-Confucianism, through the absorption of Buddhist and Daoist notions. In other words, Ricci was willing to accommodate, and by this means managed to achieve limited success in converting some important scholar officials, most notably Xu Guangqi, 1562 through 1633, Li Zhizhao, 1543 through 1630, and Yang Tingyun, 1557 through 1627. After the Manchu conquest of China in 1644, Jesuit missionaries continued to be employed in official capacities in Beijing. Johann Adam Schall von Bell, 1592 through 1666, Ricci's successor at court, was retained by the new Qing dynasty as their astronomer. Later, Jesuits, especially Ferdinand Verbiest, 1623 through 88, gained the favor of the great emperor Kangxi, 1662 through 1722. The middle years of his reign being the high point of early Catholicism in China, culminating with the promulgation of an imperial edict of toleration for the Christian religion in 1692. Yet not long afterwards, developments would come to a head that would severely test the Christian enterprise in China. In this connection, it should be noted that the Jesuits at court were no longer the only missionaries in China. Other Jesuits, as well as members of different mendicant orders and the Missions Étrangères de Paris, had established themselves in increasing numbers in the provinces. Here the missionaries concentrated not primarily on the conversion of the ruling class, but worked among the common people. In the towns and villages, they came face to face with Chinese popular religion, with its beliefs in miracles and exorcism, the worship of images, practices of divination, and acts of healing performed by holy men. The indigenous inhabitants were accustomed to worshiping a vast pantheon of popular deities. The practice of ancestor worship was ubiquitous, as was that of geomancy, feng shui. Having been exposed to the realities of popular beliefs and practices, The provincial missionaries were less willing to make the same efforts at accommodation as the court-based Jesuits in Beijing. Thus, in time, serious differences emerged within the missionary community. For 100 years or so, the notorious rights controversy caused a great deal of bad blood. This protracted controversy involved more than simply adaptation to Chinese culture. It was complicated by European national rivalries and the competing ambitions of different religious orders, essentially but not exclusively between the Jesuits and the Mendicants. Furthermore, Rome was anxious to assert its own power of jurisdiction and control over missionary activity, with a view to weakening the Portuguese padroado. Nevertheless, it was the outcome of the debate concerning Confucian rites and ancestor worship that was to have such dire consequences for the Christian missions in East Asia. Should Christians be forbidden to participate in them, or did these practices have no religious significance? Should Christians be permitted to contribute to community festivals in honor of non-Christian divinities? These were difficult questions and hotly debated in China and Europe for a century. As we have seen from the beginning, some of the Jesuits had begun consciously to accommodate their methods to Chinese culture. The honoring of Confucius was a duty of scholars who had obtained literary civil service degrees. The ceremony was, therefore, an act of respect, and Matteo Ricci believed that it did not contain any superstitions. He claimed that the ultimate purpose and the general intention of Confucianism was for public peace and order in the kingdom, and for the benefit of the family. He argued that the scholar officials did not recite prayers to ask for favors from Confucius, and the kowtow, touching the ground with the forehead, was performed solely out of respect for the great sage. Although Ricci supported a policy of accommodation with Confucianism, he did not accept all aspects of it. For example, he rejected the orthodox Neo-Confucianism as superstitious, perverse, and leading the Chinese away from the one true God. His policy of selective accommodation is most clear in his attitudes towards ancestral and Confucian rites. He could tolerate those rites in which the superstitious practices seemed minimal. In other respects, however, Ricci forbade converts to say prayers and make petitions to the dead. He also condemned the belief that the dead received benefit and nourishment from offerings of food and the burning of paper money. Similarly, Ricci and the other early Jesuit missionaries did impose certain restrictions on converts accustomed to participate in Confucian ceremonies. They forbade the converts of the gentry class from taking part in any ceremony honoring Confucius in which animals were killed and sacrificed. This they considered too superstitious. However, their missionary adversaries found this compromise unacceptable. Another major issue that gave rise to intellectual controversies and contradictions within the missionary community concerned the nature and rendering of the word God. As part of his strategy of accommodation, Ricci had adopted the policy of taking over or even exploiting the ideas and expressions of Chinese classical tradition, so as to demonstrate that Chinese culture had originally included a belief in ideas that were Christian. It was in this way that he adopted the two expressions, Shangdi, or sovereign on high, and Tian, heaven, as evidence of early Chinese belief in a single deity. At the outset of his mission in 1583, Ricci chose the term Tianzhu, master of heaven, to render God. But at the suggestion of some Chinese scholars, he later tended to use the term Shangdi, believing the two terms to be synonymous for his purposes. However, in 1628, the term Shangdi was rejected at a missionary conference in favor of Tianshu, and Catholic Christianity henceforth became known as Tianshu, the religion of the Lord of Heaven. In the socio-political context of imperial China, the term question and rights controversy were to have grave implications for the future of Christianity in the Middle Kingdom. The Jesuits had appealed to the Emperor Kangxi for an opinion on the key issues of the controversy, and he expressed himself as agreeing with them that honors were paid to Confucius only as legislator, that those to the ancestors were not for the purpose of asking protection, but merely a demonstration of love and a commemoration of the good the dead had done during their lives. Moreover, the emperor asserted that these sacrifices to Tian were not to the visible heavens, but to the Supreme Lord, the creator and preserver of heaven and earth and all contained therein. The emperor's statements were sent to Rome for consideration. Pope Clement X rejected them and in 1704 sent a papal legate, Charles Maillard de Tournon, 1668 through 1710, to China to convince the emperor that Rome's findings were not in contravention of Chinese imperial prerogatives. But de Tournon managed to antagonize the emperor, who was annoyed that his supreme position as Son of Heaven was being challenged. Furthermore, he was angered by the implicit assumption that some missionaries had a better knowledge of the Chinese classics than the emperor himself. Thus, in 1706, he issued an edict to the effect that all missionaries, if they wished to remain in China, had to obtain an imperial license, Peo. This was to be granted only to those who agreed to abide by the practices of Matteo Ricci. While some Chinese scholars were impressed by the Jesuits' scientific knowledge, they found the foreign religious message rather incomprehensible. As a certain Zheng Chao put it in 1699, they are extraordinarily intelligent, those people, the missionaries. Their studies concern astronomy, the calendar, medicine, and mathematics. Their customs are loyalty, good faith, constancy, and rectitude. Their skill is marvelous. The conceptions of the Great West are surely far ahead of other doctrines. It is simply a shame that they speak of a Lord of Heaven, a crude and obnoxious conception that leads them into absurdities, and which our literati have a great deal of difficulty accepting. If they could only put aside this conception, they would be very close to our Confucian tradition. Chinese intellectuals were troubled by the notion of an unseen creator who remained outside the creation. Some scholars suspected that Christianity had stolen Confucian terms to name its God and had borrowed the language of the Buddhist transmigration of the soul. Furthermore, they found it hard to understand why an all-powerful deity should have created an evil spirit who made humans do evil things. To some scholars, steeped in Neo-Confucian cosmology and the concept of the innate goodness of man's nature, Christian ideas such as the transcendent God, the need for individual prayer for God's forgiveness of sin, and the hope for otherworldly salvation appeared egotistically motivated and perverse. Such an un-Confucian, profit-oriented mind had much in common with indigenous heterodox sects. Indeed, Christianity appeared to many to be an absurd and subversive philosophy that devalued the world, destroying the three relationships between ruler and subject, father and son, and husband and wife that constitute the core of the Confucian view of individual and society. Fears of Christianity's subversiveness, real or imagined, virtually ended early hopes of success in the Confucian world of China. Matters were not helped by the decision of Pope Clement XI to bring the long rights controversy to a conclusion by ruling against the Jesuit compromise in the Constitution Ex Illa Dei of 1715. The ruling was finalized in 1742 by Pope Benedict XIV in the bull Ex Quo Singulari. The refusal by Rome to allow Christians to take part in the Confucian and ancestral rites was to have grave consequences, for the Christians of China were in effect cut off from the Confucian cultural tradition, and thereby from society at large. Reflecting the state's hostility to anything perceived as a threat to the ideological orthodoxy and social unity of the empire, Christianity was now identified as a deviant ideology. From 1724, following the fateful edict of the Emperor Yongzheng, there was a significant intensification of persecution of converts. Christians were commanded to renounce their faith. Foreign missionaries, except those attached to the Bureau of Astronomy in Beijing, were expelled from China. Church properties were confiscated and used for secular purposes. The papal abolition of the Jesuit order in 1773 and continuing quarrels amongst the China missionaries, e.g. the Beijing Schism, merely aggravated the precarious position of the Church in the Middle Kingdom. For the next 120 years, Christianity was officially proscribed as a heterodox cult. Catholicism retreated into the remoter parts of rural China, increasingly vulnerable to suppression. The few priests, Chinese and European, operating secretly in the country were able to provide rather inadequate pastoral supervision. An 18th century bishop of Nanjing, Gottfried Beethoven, S.J., described the priest's problem thus: "During the greater part of the year, we are confined to the prison of a narrow boat, in which we wander here and there. During the deep silence of the night, we slip into the houses of the Christians. Quickly and in all haste, we administer the sacraments, baptize infants and adults if there are any. After saying Mass, we have to disappear at once, in order not to be discovered by the infidels." In the absence of regular priestly care, congregations were left to their own devices for years, if not decades. This ends part 1.